It was the night before Easter in Anaheim, California, 2011. A 26-year-old mother of three, Melissa Delgado, and her newlywed husband were out enjoying their first Good Friday together as a married couple. But all was not as joyful and bright as it seemed. The very next day, on Easter Sunday morning, authorities would arrive and discover a house of horrors. While Melissa was sitting on the sofa, watching her children search for their Easter baskets, something was deeply wrong. She wasn't smiling or interacting with her kids at all. As they held up their treats to show what the Easter bunny had brought, she didn't reach out to hug them. She didn't speak a word. Her beautiful children hadn't realized that mommy was dead, dressed up by her husband to make it look as though she was still alive. Melissa Delgado was propped up on the sofa, sunglasses on, murdered. This is the heartbreaking story of a young mother who was just trying to make Easter a wonderful time for her three kids. Instead, she was murdered under the pastel decorations. This series is intended for educational purposes, to memorialize victims, and to amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. Before we get into today's episode, I want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Skillshare. It's no secret that I love to learn anything and everything through Skillshare. These days, I use it for both my personal life goals and my work life. Lately, I've been using it to become a visionary on Canva. My team and I love using Canva. We use it for thumbnails, presentations, vision boards, different fonts, images, and designs. We're a very creative set of girlies over here. We use Canva for so many aspects of creating the content you see, and thanks to Skillshare, I recently tuned into a class from Maggie Stara called Social Media Content Creation in Canva. Maggie teaches a super easy-to-follow, step-by-step class that can help you whether you're brand new and have literally never heard of Canva before, or if you're used to it and want to learn more advanced techniques. She teaches things like designing thumbnails, social media posts, integrating Canva into your business, and even how to use it with AI. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes taught by industry experts. There are classes on so many different things. I love the creative ones like creative writing and illustration. You can learn all sorts of social media skills, like editing videos if you want to become a YouTuber. If YouTube and social media aren't your thing, there are classes on how to become a freelancer, how to cook, how to be more productive. The list is endless. Their lessons are uniquely curated to help you master things at your own pace. And master them you will. Skillshare comes bearing gifts for my girlies. The first 500 people to click the link in the description and sign up for Skillshare will get a 1-month free trial. Do you realize how many classes you can get through in a month? It's an insane deal. I think you're insane if you don't take it up. So remember, the first 500 of you to click that link can claim that deal. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into this episode, I have to warn you. This is probably one of the most disturbing cases we've done all year. This one really got me. I talk about these kinds of cases week in and week out, and this one made me cry. It kept me up at night. I haven't stopped thinking about this poor woman. If this case affected me, the true crime girl who does true crime all the time, then I want that to be a big warning for you. Of course, I'll go through the more specific sensitive topics we'll cover in this case, including discussions of domestic violence, trauma-induced labor, and details of injuries and murder. Viewer discretion is advised. So now, it's time to get into the horrific and heartbreaking case of Melissa Delgado, a 26-year-old girl who suffered a true nightmare before Easter. On Easter Sunday morning, 2011, an ambulance crew in Anaheim, California, was dispatched to a local apartment complex. They'd been told that a woman had fallen over when she was drunk the night before, hit her head, and her partner thought she might have a concussion. He was the one who called 911. As the ambulance pulled into the street, they could see the guy who had called for them standing outside the apartment complex, waving them over. But as the crew entered his home, something was very off. There was a sinister air as soon as they stepped through that front door. As the ambulance crew looked around the home, they saw blood everywhere, on every single surface. There wasn't a single thing in that home untouched by blood. It was on light switches, walls, countertops, floors, everywhere. Dried blood, new blood. It was immediately clear to the paramedics that this woman hadn't just drunkenly fallen over and was now concussed. There was too much blood in this apartment for it to be innocently explained. The paramedics quickly learned that this woman's injuries went way beyond a concussion. In fact, she'd been dead for quite some time. Her name was Melissa Delgado, known as Mari to her friends. She was 26 years old at the time of her death, born on September 5, 1985, in Anaheim, California, where she was raised and stayed for the rest of her life. Marissa never knew her father, but her mother, Lydia, gave her the absolute world. Marissa and all her siblings, because she was one of 5, quite a big family, lived between her mom's house and her grandmother Norma's house. She was very close with her grandmother too, and sometimes stayed at her auntie's and uncle's homes. Marissa was such a creative little girl, right from the beginning. Her passion was anything creative. She loved to dance and create pieces of art, whether drawing or painting. She just had so many ideas, and always wanted to express herself. I think that's so sweet, so pure. We often say similar things about female victims, specifically, that they were such creative little girls. I can relate, and maybe you can too. I think back to a little version of me, and she was so creative, always painting, dancing, singing. I love reading about other women who were exactly like that as little girls. It feels like such a universal experience, that young girls are so pure, artistic, sweet, and free. Throughout her teenage years, Marissa was a very normal girl with a typical life. She still enjoyed her artistic endeavors, but they started to take a back seat to other things, like boys, as they do in teenage years. When she turned 17, her creative pursuits stopped entirely because Marissa had unexpectedly fallen pregnant. You might be wondering who got her pregnant at 17, and we're not entirely sure. We'll come back to that later. For now, it was someone. In 2003, she gave birth to her baby daughter. Marissa was still only 17 herself, but she really stepped up to become a mother. She was up for the challenge, getting multiple jobs to provide for herself and her daughter. She worked at fast food chains, clothing shops, and even picked up freelance work as a makeup artist. She dabbled in modeling too because, by the way, this woman was beautiful, an absolute knockout. She was stunning, and she knew it, which is one of my favorite things about her. We found this bikini photo shoot she'd done, and she posted it on Facebook. She loved using Facebook. She captioned it, "Mean but sexy with it." I love it. She just knew she was that girl. I love that she never lost that part of herself, even though she was a mother now. I imagine it's so hard to care for a child and still care for yourself in all the ways you always have, like making yourself look pretty, taking photos to feel good about yourself, things that aren't necessities. I love that, even as a mom, that didn't stop her from being the baddest bee in town. Marissa seemed so happy. She had a baby she loved, and she was really enjoying being a mother. The rest of her life carried on as it always had. She still had a social life, friends, and was super close with her family. Even though she was still just a kid herself, she was happy with the life she was building. Then, 5 years later, when Marissa was 22, she became pregnant again with her second daughter. Now it's time to talk about who the baby's dad was because there are 2 babies, and we're not entirely sure if they were fathered by the same man. There are conflicting stories. Some think Marissa had a high school sweetheart she got pregnant with at 17, stayed with him, and the second baby at 22 was also his. But I believe it was one of her family members who said both daughters had different dads, and neither dad was on the scene. I'm inclined to believe family members when it comes from the horse's mouth. We're all aware of the unfair stigma placed on women who have children with different dads, especially when those dads aren't around. This stigma is amplified for single black mothers like Marissa, pushing a stereotype that black men are more likely to be absent, which is steeped in racism. But regardless of whether her kids had their biological dads around, don't worry, they had loads of great father figures in their lives. Marissa had brothers and uncles who loved these girls and doted on them. To summarize, we don't know who the girls' fathers were, but what we do know is that in 2008, when Marissa gave birth to her second daughter, there was no man on the scene. For a short period, it was just those 3 girls together. But unfortunately, the safety of that trio wouldn't last long. That same year, Marissa, now a mother to a 5-year-old and a newborn, would meet a man who would change her and her children's lives forever. Derek Hensley was a 26-year-old dock worker from San Pedro, California. For years older than Marissa, she was 22 when they met. Derek's life, his upbringing, his childhood, had been very difficult. From what we could find, his father said Derek basically raised himself, which is so sad to hear from a parent. From a young age, Derek was expected to be independent. For better or worse, he had a lot of control over his life. But this control would soon find its way onto Marissa, and it would quickly become abusive. Merely months after they met, Derek moved into Marissa's apartment. She barely knew this guy, but he inserted himself into her life and her little family. She liked him, though, and had her rose-tinted glasses on. When you have those glasses on, all the red flags just look like normal flags. During what was supposed to be the blissful honeymoon stage, Derek switched. He put his hands on Marissa and beat her so badly she was unrecognizable when her mom and friend later found her. Let that sink in to her own mother. She needed hospital treatment. It was brutal. She arrived at the hospital with swelling across her face and head, entire clumps of her hair ripped out. It was such an evil, sinister attack on a woman he claimed to love. It wouldn't happen just once. This was about to happen to Melissa again and again. We don't know specifically what triggered his violent rages, but honestly, with men like Derek, and we've seen this in cases like Mike Tyson or Wei Dong from the Chinese TikToker case, their anger is never really over anything real or tangible. A lot of the time, it's things they've made up in their heads, like jealousy over a man who doesn't exist or the potential of another man stealing their woman. We have no idea what specifically triggered Derek, but what we do know is that his rage was fueled by a lot of alcohol. The next incident happened in July 2008. Marissa was taking a bath when Derek stumbled into the bathroom drunk. He was enraged, looking for an argument. Marissa had seen him like this so many times that she just wanted to protect herself. She didn't want to engage in the argument, she just wanted to get away. As she tried to leave the bathroom, he grabbed her and slammed her head against the wall. When she fell to the ground, he grabbed her by her hair and dragged her to the bedroom. He wasn't done there. He proceeded to strangle Marissa with his bare hands and continued to beat her until she was completely unconscious. Even then, with her completely limp, motionless, unresponsive, passed out, this man was still going. He was screaming at her unconscious body that he was going to kill her. It's so horrifying because men like that mean it. Look how far he took it, until she looked dead to him. Yet his anger wasn't dissipating. He wanted to keep taking it out on this innocent woman. At this point, Marissa was passed out on the bed, and he was still screaming abuse at her, which actually woke her up. When she came to, she was desperately trying to defend herself, scratching at him, begging for her life. It got to the point where she had to run out of the apartment. I don't know if she'd even managed to put clothes on. Remember, this started when she was in the bath. Can you imagine having to run out into the streets for safety? She ran to a neighbor or a passerby to call the police against her boyfriend, this man she lived with, this man she allowed around her children. By the time the police responded, Derek had run away because he knew he'd be in serious trouble. They couldn't find him at the house, so they couldn't do anything. Marissa had to wait until the next morning when Derek returned. She called the police again, and they arrested him. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor in domestic violence and was jailed for 19 days. That's it. In July 2008, he was in and out of jail within a month. I cannot believe it was a misdemeanor when he beat her unconscious and threatened to kill her. This case is a prime example of how domestic violence perpetrators are never taken seriously enough until they actually kill someone, and then it's too late. How much closer could he have gotten to killing her that day? He couldn't have gotten any closer if he tried. He strangled her with his bare hands, beat her until she was unconscious, and was still screaming at her limp, lifeless body that he wanted to kill her. How is that a misdemeanor? How is it only 19 days in jail? How are the police not taking this man seriously? According to statistics, it takes a woman an average of 7 attempts to leave before she successfully escapes her abuser. For the next 3 years of her life, Marissa was trapped in a cycle of exactly that. She managed to take out a protection order against Derek, meaning they weren't legally allowed to be in contact for her safety. Initially, after his 19 days in jail, she didn't want to take him back. Why would she? He had almost beaten her to death at least twice in a few months. But he persisted, kept trying, and soon found the perfect excuse to coax her back, convincing her he was a changed man. He insisted he had found God. This happened when he was sent back to jail. After his 19-day sentence, he had about 3 months out before being sent back in on drug charges, and I think a burglary. He was in prison for almost 2 years, from November 2008 to October 2010. During this time, he told Marissa he was now a man of faith, living to serve God, a born-again Christian. He filled her head with how he was a changed man who would do better, pouring out his heart and love to her. Honestly, this was everything Marissa had wanted from him. Despite how evil he'd been deep down, she was still in love with him. She had tried to protect herself for a long time, but now she thought she could trust him when he said he'd changed. She really hoped everything he was saying was genuine. Some people do go to prison, find God, become born-again Christians, and come out determined to be better, to live religiously. It changes people, it really does. But was Derek Hensley going to be one of those people? I don't think so. It worked on Marissa, though. While he was still in prison, he convinced her to start visiting him again. She would regularly come to see him, and catch up until he was released in October 2010. When that happened, he moved right back in with Marissa and her 2 daughters. Their relationship kicked into gear again, but it wouldn't be long before this born-again Christian's halo would slip and the devil would show his true self. Marissa's Facebook posts, once filled with love, happiness, and joy, saying things like, "Today is a beautiful day. It feels so great to find your own true inner happiness," turned into emotional statements where she vented about feeling disrespected, played, and lied to. Derek had begun beating her again, regularly, and he was cheating on her too, something she often found evidence of when she went through his phone. Whenever confronted, Derek went into classic manipulator mode. He'd say Marissa was crazy, reading into things too much. For the affairs he couldn't refute, he'd insist the woman came on to him, that it was her fault, that she was trying to break their relationship. No matter the situation, Derek was always the victim, never the enemy. Even when she found evidence of his infidelity, he'd somehow blame someone else. I think he was trying to isolate him and Marissa from the rest of the world, like it was them versus everyone else. They couldn't trust anyone but each other, so they should stick together. The terrifying thing about manipulators is when they use the right words and play on your emotions, you start to believe them. Marissa would find these women on Facebook that Derek claimed had come on to him, trying to tear apart their relationship, and she'd give them a piece of her mind. She was being told there were women trying to steal her man, led to believe he was innocent, so she was batting them away. She updated her status to reflect the hurt and anger she felt over his affairs. In one post, she said, "I don't know why expletive are so goddamn stupid as expletive. People make me want to slap the dog expletive out of them." Her friends commented, supporting her, saying, "Yeah, why can't these women find their own man? Why do they need to steal yours?" Derek had manipulated not only Marissa, but her friends too into believing this was the case, while he was just being an absolute rat, playing all these women against each other while living in Marissa's house. He'd successfully convinced Marissa to blame others, not him, the man who promised to be faithful and broke that promise. We wondered while looking into this case if there's a pattern. Are men who physically abuse their partners more likely to cheat? Apparently, there's no known link, but there's a difference in how physically abusive men cheat compared to non-abusive men. Violent men seem to want to justify their affairs, feeling they deserve the right to cheat. They don't fear their partner finding out like non-violent men do, who try to cover it up. Violent men don't care because, worst case, they'll intimidate or beat their partner until it's not a problem anymore. The infidelity becomes part of the abuse. Derek Hensley was a rotten man in so many ways. For the next year, he was in and out of jail for short stints, things like drugs. He was a generally criminal man. Every time he came out of jail, he'd move back into Marissa's home with her 2 daughters. Let me remind you, he was in the presence of 2 tiny girls. Every time he returned, he'd start beating Marissa again. His abuse would spiral out of control in front of these kids. At this point, the restraining order Marissa had taken out still legally stood, so every time the police were called for any instance of abuse, he beat her regularly. They had grounds to arrest him. Marissa eventually got the restraining order lifted, but it took about a year. We don't know if it was fully her choice or if she'd been manipulated by Derek to remove it. Obviously, that would make his life easier if he could abuse her without getting arrested every time. Throughout all this abuse, which had been going on for years, Marissa tried to get away from this man so many times. But Derek, like many abusive men, was a master at apologizing, or at least manipulating an apology, manipulating Marissa into forgiving him. If that didn't work, he'd beat her and threaten to kill her instead, and that would work. Marissa really believed he could, and would kill her if he wanted to. Not only had he shown he was capable, strangling and beating her unconscious, but he knew dangerous, scary people. He could even get her killed in a way that probably wouldn't trace back to him. Marissa was fully aware of how dangerous the men Derek hung around with were, and that scared her too. There are so many layers to this, and it all cycles into each other. The next time he beat her, she'd forgive him because if she didn't, the next beating could be worse, or it might not even be him. He might get someone else to finish the job. She was very aware that any one of these times could be the last. While Derek was in prison for those 2 years, it was easier for Marissa to forget the terrible parts of their relationship. She'd only see glimpses of his good side when she visited him. Her Facebook posts were practically counting down the days until he was out, as she was so excited to have him back. It's almost as if she was trying to convince herself this was part of their tortured love story, like they were star-crossed lovers meant to be together no matter how hard it got. Soon, their story would take a turn that would bind them together more than ever. In 2011, Melissa Delgado fell pregnant with Derek Hensley's baby. This filled her with hope. She thought that if she was carrying his baby, he might treat her with more care and stop beating her. But Melissa was wrong. He continued to beat her, worse than ever. One time during her pregnancy, she had to flee for safety, running to hide in a grocery store because he was screaming at her and beating her in public. Another time, she was hospitalized for an injured eardrum, likely after he punched her so hard in the head it messed up her hearing. In August 2011, now heavily pregnant with his child, Melissa had to run away from him again when he beat her severely. She called her mom to come save her. When Lydia arrived, she found her daughter lying in the street, curled up in the fetal position, crying, her body covered in bruises, including her pregnant belly. How can anyone be so evil as to punch a woman directly in her belly, knowing a tiny baby is growing in there? It was his baby too. If he didn't even have a protective instinct for his own child, it was a complete lost cause. Melissa knew she was living in hell with this man. On Facebook, she posted, "No matter how much you think somebody's going to change, things just get worse. When someone has no respect for you, they never will." Melissa knew things had to change, that this had to end. She was looking at her life, realizing it was nothing like what she'd envisioned for herself. She used to dream of a career, independence, and making a lasting impact on others. But she'd given all that up because she was just trying to survive day to day. Now she was ready, better late than never, to pursue the career she'd always dreamed of. It would be one of the first steps to getting out of this horrific relationship. If she had a stable career and her own money, she might be able to run away. So, in September 2011, Melissa enrolled in Cypress College, taking classes to become a domestic violence counselor. This course would not only equip her with a positive, long-lasting career to help others, but might also teach her how to curb Derek's violence while she was still in it. While Melissa was in school every day, Derek agreed to watch her two daughters, now aged 8 and 3. But she could never fully rely on him. At first, he said, "Don't worry, I'll look after your kids," but he quickly got sick of staying home with them. I think part of it was that he hated Melissa having independence, doing something for herself, working on herself. He didn't like that. He didn't know who was around her at college. He'd blow up her phone, demanding to know who she was with, threatening her all the time. We don't know the specifics of these threats. He was just always trying to have power over her and keep her down. By this point, his violent outbursts were so regular, he was taking every little piece of his anger out on Melissa, on her body, on her pregnant belly. He was also trying to isolate her from the rest of her life. She wasn't allowed to see her friends, was struggling to see her family, and even struggled to go to college without him blowing up her phone. Melissa just wanted it to stop. She was desperate to find a way to calm him down. On November 7, 2011, despite her family's pleas not to, Melissa married Derek Hensley. She hoped that officially becoming husband and wife would improve their relationship, especially since a lot of Derek's triggers were jealousy, paranoia, and worries about Melissa finding another guy. She thought that by devoting herself to him in the eyes of the law and God, remember, he's Mr. Born-Again Christian, she'd give him a bigger sense of security, and he'd lose this violent paranoia, knowing she was his wife. But are we surprised that being married didn't mean a thing to Derek Hensley? If anything, being married gave him an even stronger sense of ownership over Melissa. He felt entitled to her time, her energy. On their wedding night, Derek beat his wife so badly she went into premature labor. The very next day, just a month earlier, Melissa had posted on Facebook, so hopeful and excited to welcome her first son into the world. She wondered what kind of man, what kind of little boy her son would grow into. As we mentioned, Melissa always loved art. When heavily pregnant, she took a photo of herself and her bump next to a big mural, posting it with the caption, "I love this artwork, it's beautiful to me. I wonder if my son is going to be an artistic person." That speaks so much to Melissa's character, her strength, her resilience. She was going through absolute hell at Derek's hands, but still had hopes for a happy, safe future for her son and family. Melissa was one of 5 siblings from a big family, and she was slowly building that same big family herself. But of course, the last thing her husband would do after beating her into premature labor was give her space and peace to recover. Just 2 weeks after the birth of their son, on November 24th, Derek lost his temper with Marissa again, this time at a family Thanksgiving dinner. The thing that sparked it was insane. Marissa had asked her sister's husband, her literal brother-in-law, to show her how to do something on her phone. Derek didn't like it. He didn't like how close they were getting. His jealousy and paranoia were never logical and couldn't be reasoned with. He was so angry that night. Marissa's family said he looked like he could tear her to pieces. She didn't want to go home with him. By April 2011, Marissa was completely broken. She'd given up hope that her education in domestic violence could change him because he couldn't be helped or fixed. This man was just so evil. Mari knew she needed to pass her exams and get herself and her children the hell out of that house with that man. But devastatingly, time for Marissa was running out. On April 9th, just a month after giving birth to her son, Marissa was back in the hospital to get a gash on the back of her head glued together, another injury from her husband. At this point, hospital staff had begun to recognize Melissa Delgado. She was in every other week with some insane injury, a swollen head, a black eye, bruises all over, and now a massive gash. They were very suspicious that Marissa was in constant danger at home and tried to involve the police. But Marissa was terrified of police involvement. She knew that if Derek got into trouble, it would only make him angrier, and that anger would be taken out on her. She was so worried he'd kill her if she went to the police and seriously tried to get him taken down for all the horrific things he'd done. In the hospital for these injuries, she lied to the police, saying she was attacked by a stranger on the street and wouldn't be able to identify them, so there was no point looking into it. I don't know if the police believed her, probably not, but they couldn't do anything. She wouldn't let them. A few days later, Marissa was out of the hospital, and Derek sent her to the shop for groceries. When she got there, she realized she didn't have enough money for everything he'd asked for. She was terrified to go home without the things he wanted. She knew she'd get screamed at and beaten. She didn't know how bad it could get because his anger was never rational. Marissa was so worried about going home empty-handed that she stood outside the grocery store, begging passers-by for spare change. The alternative was going home and being beaten bloody by her husband. But even despite all that, it wasn't enough for Derek. Marissa had either taken too long or returned empty-handed because he lost it with her regardless and became violent again. During this fit of rage, Marissa called her mom, begging her to come save her, to rescue her. On the other end of the phone, Lydia could hear Derek punching Marissa in the stomach repeatedly, telling her to hang up. Lydia was too far away to do anything physically, so she called Marissa's grandmother, Norma. When Norma arrived, the scene broke her heart. Marissa and her 3 children, one a newborn baby, were standing out in the pouring rain. The little boy who lived next door was standing in front of Marissa and her kids, between her and Derek, trying to protect her. Norma got Marissa and the 3 kids in her car and took them away from Derek, just for a few hours of peace. They drove to a local mall to calm down. But that peace didn't last long. Derek jumped in his car, followed them to the mall, tracked them down, and demanded Marissa and all 3 kids get back in his car and come home with him. Once he got them back to the house, Derek turned on his manipulation tactics and persuaded Marissa to forgive him. She did because, at this point, she didn't really have a choice. There was the illusion of choice, sure, but had she chosen not to forgive him and walk away, he would have beaten her, possibly until he killed her, or at the very least, made her life a living hell forever. That's why it's never as easy as just leave when someone's partner is abusive. It's so hard to leave safely with the rest of your life intact. A week after this incident, on April 17th, Marissa and her grandmother went on a shopping trip to buy the kids Easter baskets and treats. Marissa was pulling out all the stops this year. She wanted to make this Easter the best her kids had ever had. She and her grandmother were walking around the mall, having a great day, a nice girly shopping day. Of course, Derek couldn't help but spoil it. He was texting and calling Marissa's phone nonstop, paranoid about who she was with, already angry, demanding she either come home or let him join the shopping trip. She was literally spending time with her grandma. When Norma noticed her granddaughter couldn't get off the phone because her husband was so weirdly paranoid, she asked her, "How are you living like this?" Marissa broke down in tears, saying she was fearing for her life lately. She felt she couldn't leave this man, no matter how much she wanted to, because she believed he would kill her if she tried. She told her grandma she was making long-term plans to leave him. She just needed to get her exams out of the way, get a job with the qualifications from her course, and then she'd be able to move on and make a life for herself away from Derek. But both Norma and Marissa were terrified that all the time she thought she might run out. Just a week later, on Good Friday, April 24th, 2011, that time would tick down faster than ever, and their worst fears would become reality. It was 9 p.m. Marissa and Derek had gone to a neighbor's house for a little Easter weekend party. The night was going pretty well. They were drinking, chatting, eating festive foods. They seemed to be getting on fine as a couple and having a great time with their friends. But after a few hours of festive fun, the two got into an argument, apparently about having left the kids at home. All three were home alone, 8 years old, 3 years old, and 7 weeks old. We don't know which one wasn't happy about it, but an argument broke out, and they left abruptly by midnight, in bad moods, still arguing. As soon as they returned home, as soon as that door shut behind them, their verbal argument, like always, turned violent. This altercation grew so loud it woke the kids. The oldest, the 8-year-old girl, came out of her bedroom from her slumber to try to calm everything down. Of course, it didn't work. Instead, this 8-year-old would witness the most horrific scenes that night, scenes a child should never have to see. In front of her 8-year-old daughter, Derek began violently beating Marissa. He was pushing her, punching her, slapping her, throwing her to the ground. Marissa was screaming and shouting, begging him to stop, so much so that the neighbors overheard the commotion. I assume they heard commotion from Marissa and Derek's house a lot, so they didn't do anything about it on Good Friday. But they really should have. By around 1 a.m., the violence had been going on for almost an hour. Marissa was beaten bloody, but she managed to escape the apartment. She ran outside, and a neighbor saw it happen. They were looking out their window and saw Marissa running out, Derek running up behind her, slamming her into the ground, picking her up, and carrying her back inside the apartment she was trying to escape. This neighbor did absolutely nothing. It's devastating to think someone could see that with their own eyes. A woman trying to escape, a man dragging her back, and do nothing. They went back to bed and forgot it happened. It's one thing to ignore noise from a noisy house that's always yelling, but to see her trying to run away and being dragged back and not think to call the police? That's insane. Some people are wary of calling 911 in case they misjudge a situation and don't want to waste police time. But in a violent situation like this, it's worth calling, even as a precaution. The police absolutely should have been called that night. If they had, maybe things would have ended differently. But a 911 call was never made, and no one was coming to save Melissa Delgado. Now trapped back in the apartment, Derek cornered her in the living room and continued to violently beat her in this drunken rage. Then he pushed her into a glass table. The whole thing shattered underneath her, slicing into her skin from all angles. To make this even worse, Derek wasn't just traumatizing Marissa with this violence. He got her 8-year-old daughter involved. He ordered her to go to mommy and pick all the glass shards out of her wounds and clean up the blood. What an evil, evil man to make an 8-year-old try to save her mom like that. She would have been terrified, not only for her mom but for her whole family. Why has this man just thrown her mom into a glass table? But all Derek cared about was the mess, the blood everywhere, the glass shards. It was an inconvenience, and he didn't want to clean it up, so he traumatized this 8-year-old. Once the little girl had picked most of the glass out of her mommy's wounds, Derek grabbed Marissa and dragged her into the bathroom with her daughter. He made her daughter watch everything that was about to happen. She was confused, overwhelmed with fear. Derek dragged her mom into the bathroom, ran a bath, and dumped her in it so all that blood and his crimes could wash away. As Marissa lay in that bath, her body was limp. She was in and out of consciousness, having lost so much blood. The violence had been going on for over an hour. She'd endured an hour's worth of beatings. Her body was weak, giving up. In front of Derek, her husband, and her 8-year-old daughter, Derek was hoping dunking her in the bath might not only wash away the evidence, but maybe undo it, wake Marissa up, snap her out of this daze from the hour's worth of violence. It wasn't working, so he decided to try something else. He grabbed Marissa's limp body out of the bath, and as he lifted her, he slipped and dropped her. Marissa's head slammed into the side of the toilet bowl. She began to make this groaning, mourning, gurgling noise, and then silence. After that, Marissa didn't make a single noise. It was now 2 a.m. Derek picked up Marissa's body from the ground again and dragged her into the bedroom. He dumped her body onto the bed, sent her 8-year-old daughter back to bed, and went to sleep himself. We don't know where in the apartment he slept, but it's believed it was right next to Marissa. But the night doesn't end there, and it somehow gets even worse. During the night, as Marissa's body lay on their bed unresponsive, her 7-week-old son began to cry out in the other room for a feeding. He was hungry. Derek got up, grabbed the baby from his cradle, took him over to where his mother's lifeless body lay, and laid the baby on Marissa's chest to feed. I have no words for that. The next morning was Easter Sunday, April 25th, 2011, a day Marissa had been so excited for, a day she'd been preparing to make special for her children. Her daughters were at that perfect age where Easter egg hunts are still so magical. It was also her and Derek's first Easter together as a married couple with their own baby. There were so many reasons this day was supposed to be special. Even though Marissa had given up on the idea of a perfect Easter long ago, she at least hoped for a nice one, just for her kids. At 8:30 a.m., Marissa's 2 daughters woke up giddy, bouncing around the room, excited to hunt for their Easter baskets and see what the Easter bunny had left for them. It might sound strange that her 8-year-old, who witnessed all that violence the night before, could wake up feeling happy and excited. But you have to think how normal this extreme violence had become in their household. The girls witnessed their mom being beaten regularly, savagely, with a swollen face, massive gashes, black eyes. But she'd always wake up the next morning. There was always the next day. Despite what the 8-year-old saw, she expected to wake up and find her mom roughed up, tender, but recovering there. But Marissa wasn't responding or recovering at all on Easter Sunday morning. What Derek did next is truly one of the most haunting, disturbing things I've ever heard in a true crime case. You know how long I've been looking into cases. This is something out of a horror film. Derek picked up Marissa's dead body and carried her into the living room. He placed her on the sofa, propped up her body like a life-size doll, and put sunglasses on her to hide her swollen, shut eyes. Then he called in the little girls to start their Easter egg hunt while their mom's dead body sat on the sofa, watching them. If that wasn't horrific enough, this demonic man took it one step further. The girls noticed quickly that something was wrong with Mommy. She wasn't reacting, talking, or even smiling when they showed her their Easter treats. They knew it was weird. Derek tried to explain her lack of response by saying, "Mommy ruined Easter. She got drunk and ruined Easter." But Marissa's eldest daughter, the 8-year-old who witnessed everything the night before, could tell something was seriously wrong. When she reached out to touch her mom, she felt how cold and hard her skin was. She called out, "Mommy," but Marissa didn't respond because at some point during the early hours of April 25th, 2011, the cold cruelty of her husband's relentless abuse had finally taken her life. Melissa Delgado was only 26 years old, a mother to 3, when her life was snuffed out by Derek Hensley. Now her body sat cold and stiff, dressed up in sunglasses, in front of her 3 children as they hunted for their Easter baskets. Baskets she'd spent hours picking out and carefully preparing. Marissa's last act as a mother was to make sure her children woke up to a fun Easter morning, an Easter she never got to see them enjoy. By this point, Derek was really panicking. I think he'd been hoping Marissa would come around, that she'd wake up. That's what always happened. Every time he beat her within an inch of her life, she'd recover, bounce back, be there the next day. But she wasn't coming around this time. Well into Easter Sunday, it was clear Marissa wasn't waking up. Her body was cold and hardening, and Derek was quickly realizing he was a murderer. He had a dead body on his hands, and was panicking about what to do. At 9 a.m., Derek made a call, not to 911, but to Marissa's mother, to tell her they'd gotten into an argument the night before, that Marissa had drunkenly fallen, hit her head, and wasn't waking up. He said she'd bled everywhere and had been unresponsive since 2 a.m., but he hadn't called 911. He waited until the next morning to call her mom. In this call to Lydia, he didn't even seem fully panicked, like he had a plan to help Marissa. He was essentially saying, "You come around and help." Lydia pleaded with him to call an ambulance, to get her daughter help. Do you know what he said? No. He said he didn't have time, that he had to leave and didn't have time to wait for responders or fill out a police report. He basically had better things to do with his Easter Sunday than try to save his wife's life. For the next 30 minutes, Derek kept delaying calling 911. He called practically everyone but 911. He called Marissa's grandmother, Norma, next, who again begged him to call an ambulance. He told Norma he knew how bad this looked, so he couldn't call the police because he'd go to prison. That terrified Norma. If he wasn't guilty, why would that be his first thought? Clearly, her granddaughter was in grave danger, if he was already thinking he could go to prison for what he'd done. The next call was Marissa's cousin calling Derek because by now, the news had traveled through the family. Everyone was panicking. The cousin begged and pleaded with Derek to call an ambulance. Derek was reluctant, but becoming hysterical over the phone. It was all becoming real. He'd murdered Marissa and staged her body, and now everyone was on their way. Her whole family knew something was wrong. People were turning up any minute, and an ambulance would be there sooner or later, whether he called or someone else did. At 9:30 a.m., he tried one last time to stay one step ahead and called the ambulance himself. He seemed relatively calm on the call, certainly not like he thought his wife was dead and beyond saving. He told the dispatcher she'd gotten really drunk, fallen, hit her head, and might have a concussion. But when the paramedics arrived, they instantly knew something seriously violent had happened in this apartment. When Derek met them on the porch and led them inside, there was blood everywhere. Not a single surface without a smear of blood, whether old, dried blood or new blood. There were so many different violent attacks recorded via blood smears on everything, light switches, walls, floors, countertops, even her children's toys. It was in every room, her kids' room, on her bedding, the headboard, the front door. There wasn't a single inch of their home that hadn't seen Marissa's pain, either from that night or the years of this abusive relationship. It was all confirmed to be her blood, no question. But one thing was very out of place. The clothes Marissa was wearing had not a speck of blood on them. We know that's because Derek had dumped her in the bath and reclothed her to get rid of the evidence on her body. Her clothes were the only things in the entire house without her blood. If that's not suspicious, I don't know what is. The paramedics knew exactly what kind of situation they'd been called to, a murder scene. They called the police, who quickly arrived and arrested Derek Hensley on suspicion of murder. When Marissa's body was taken for an autopsy, the list of her injuries was devastatingly long. She was covered in that man's anger. Her final cause of death was a brain hemorrhage due to blunt force trauma. The evidence in this case was overwhelming. It was all over her body, all over their apartment. Her family could bear witness to the fact that this man had been abusing Marissa for years. But even though this seemed like a slam-dunk case to get him in jail and get Marissa justice, the trial would be delayed for almost a decade. Derek spent the next 9 years held in jail on a $1 million bond, awaiting trial. 9 years without a trial sounds insane, and it is, but there are reasons for it. To unpack them properly would take a whole video, so we'll just scratch the surface here. I wanted to explain a bit, because it caught me off guard that he was held for 9 years without movement in this case. Firstly, Derek was a black man. While I'm not advocating for Derek as an individual, he's guilty, evil, and deserves those 9 years. It runs deeper than him. This is institutional. A 2002 report found that across America, young black men were about 50% more likely to be detained pre-trial than white defendants. Not only is this a broken system for black individuals accused, but it's also broken for black victims who need justice, like Melissa Delgado. A lack of movement in Marissa's case is a lack of justice for her. Her trial was delayed for nearly a decade. Her family had to wait that long. This broken system for black victims isn't just in America. It's reflected here in the UK too. Black victims of domestic violence in the UK are less likely to see their abuser convicted compared to white victims. Between 2016 and 2020, UK police filed charges in only 6.7% of cases where the victim was white, low enough, but where the victim was black, it dropped to 5.5%. Police are less likely to file charges when the victim is black. But this institutional issue wasn't the only thing Marissa's trial was up against. Another reason for Derek's 9-year detainment was that the main witness was an 8-year-old child, Marissa's oldest daughter. She not only witnessed the entire attack, but was forced to pull glass shards from her mom's wounds in the middle of it. She heard her mother's final noises, those gurgles after her head hit the toilet. She watched her mom die at 8 years old. The courts wanted this little girl to be older before she could give reliable evidence because, up until this point, her story had changed a bit here and there. I imagine her story changed initially because she was so scared of Derek Hensley. For an 8-year-old, so many factors were at play. Her mom had just died, she watched it happen, and maybe she was scared of what Derek could do to her too if she told the truth. This little girl had lived in an abusive environment for years. Derek always threatened Marissa that he'd kill her if she went to the police, and this girl heard it so many times, saw it with her own eyes. Of course, she believed he'd kill her too. She needed time to process this trauma and grow without being terrorized by his anger and threats lingering in her mind. She needed to feel safe to give evidence. So, that was a huge reason this case took so long to go to trial. It rested on this 8-year-old's shoulders, and there was no way they'd put her through that. In March 2021, after an agonizing 9-year wait, Marissa's case was finally heard in court. Even all these years later, Derek maintained the same story. That night, Marissa got belligerently drunk, picked an argument with him, drunkenly fell, hit her head, and had a concussion. He stuck to that. He also tried to explain away other evidence, like the smashed glass table, saying she threw herself into it. He argued he never pushed her. She gave herself all those extensive injuries on the day she died. He had excuses for everything, claiming he wasn't at fault for anything that happened that night. What really did him in was that Marissa's eldest daughter was now 17 years old and ready to tell her truth on the stand. She stood up there so bravely and relived the horrors she witnessed at 8 years old. She told the court that on Good Friday 2011, she saw Derek Hensley violently, savagely beating her mother in every room of the house. She saw him push her mother onto the glass table that shattered underneath her after she tried to escape the apartment. A neighbor saw her run out and get dragged back in but did nothing. Marissa's daughter told the court that, despite her mom's skin being badly cut from falling onto the glass table, her mom was still alive. She relived the part where she was pulling shards from her mother's wounds, saying her mother was bleeding badly but still alive. She probably would have survived if it had stopped there. But this poor girl was forced to follow Derek as he carried her mother into the bathroom and dumped her into a bath of water. She watched as he washed her mother's limp body, lifting her arms to get to the wounds, cuts, and blood all over her. As this happened, she could see her mom fading in and out of consciousness, coming back and falling out again. She'd lost so much blood, her body was so weak. This little girl had to watch every second of it. But it was when she watched him pull Marissa out of the bath that he dropped her. She witnessed Marissa's head smash into the side of the toilet bowl, making those gurgling noises. That was the moment she believed her mom died, that Derek had finally killed her. Her testimony completely lined up with all the forensic evidence, from her mom's body to the apartment, even where the blood was in each room. This explained why there was blood on the front door, in the kids' room, on the headboard of her mom's bed. Her story matched all the evidence perfectly and proved Derek Hensley to be a liar. On April 7, 2021, Derek Hensley was convicted of second-degree murder and domestic abuse. The reason it was second-degree and not first-degree murder was because the blow to her head that killed her was kind of an accident, when he slipped while picking her up from the bath, and her head smashed against the toilet. Even though he meant every punch he landed up to that point, the one that killed her was accidental. Maybe there's even a world where this could have been manslaughter. Don't quote me, I'm not educated in the American legal system, but what sold it as second-degree murder was everything else he did. Him putting off calling an ambulance until well into the next day, despite her mom, grandma, and cousin begging him to get help, showed he was reluctant because he knew it was too late. If he'd called an ambulance when she hit her head on the toilet and made those gurgling noises, things wouldn't have been as bad for him. But he was such an evil person who only cared about himself. He never cared about Marissa or her kids. Medics testified that if he'd called an ambulance when her head hit the toilet, there was a good chance they could have saved her. But because he didn't want to involve the police, didn't take her for help, he left her to die overnight. If an ambulance had been called, Marissa would have been saved, and her kids would still have a mom today. Derek Hensley was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. An allowance was made for the 9 years he'd already served while awaiting trial, meaning he could be out as early as 2027. In the wake of Marissa's death, her grandmother Norma said something that summarized how much Derek had drained the life out of her even before he killed her. Norma said Marissa was an amazing dancer who loved dancing since she was a kid. Remember, we spoke about that, but after she met Derek, she never danced again. Instead, he made her life hell. Marissa was trapped in a horrific cycle of abuse that she herself wrote about in her college papers. My God, every time I remember she was studying to counsel victims of domestic violence just like herself, it sends shivers down my spine and shatters my heart into a million pieces. All this woman wanted was to save herself and other women in her position. Instead, she was murdered. The last essay Marissa submitted for her college course, just a month before Derek killed her, detailed the red flags and stages of an abusive relationship, how to identify when it's getting worse. She wrote, "Firstly comes the tension-building phase, which may be accompanied by minor assaults, during which time the woman believes she can deflect her husband's bullying by conceding to his wishes. Secondly comes the battering episode. At this point, the man is out of control and acts in a rage. And finally, the reconciliation period. Here, the batterer transforms himself into a very apologetic, tender, and loving character." Another element that breaks my heart is how much her life was consumed with thinking about this abuse. She always felt she had to protect herself and stay one step ahead of what he could do to her. That's probably why she wanted to be so educated on it. Even when she wasn't at home being abused, she was at college thinking about the abuse she was going through. There was never peace, calm, or release for her. At Derek Hensley's trial, his friends and family testified that Marissa hit him too, claiming they had a mutually violent relationship. His cousin said he'd seen Derek with a black eye and scratches from Marissa. But this doesn't mean they were mutually abusive. The level of abuse was definitely not mutual. We can tell from how many hospitalizations Marissa had. There are many explanations for why Marissa might have put her hands on him. Reactionary abuse, self-defense. It's more common than you think for the abused to become an abuser in retaliation, to stand up for themselves. They're so used to violence they think, if you're allowed to beat me, give me a black eye, why can't I stand up for myself when you get violent? As Marissa's paper talks about, abuse happens in a cycle. Once a victim has been through it a few times, they become hyper-aware, able to predict when the stages are coming. When an abused woman senses that tension building, knowing it's heading to the next stage, it's not uncommon for her to provoke the man into violence to get it over with. She knows it's coming, so she might as well try to get it out of the way, consciously or subconsciously. A victim might speed up the worst, most violent parts of the cycle to get back to the safer parts where things are mellower. Maybe that's where Marissa's physical retaliation came in. When an abusive cycle keeps repeating, it becomes like clockwork, and the violence escalates until, tragically, a death like Marissa's takes place. This brings me to today's charity shoutout. We wanted to talk about something different today. We're shouting out a UK-based black feminist organization called IMCAN. IMCAN is dedicated to stopping violence against black and minority ethnic women and girls by collaborating with smaller organizations and charities across the UK. On their website is a directory full of useful resources for all women, no matter your ethnicity or religion. There are websites and numbers you can call for help. If you or anyone you know is experiencing abuse, the IMCAN website directory and our link tree in the description of every episode are full of resources, numbers, websites, and support. I want to take a second to let you know that you are loved and so much stronger than you think. If you're going through anything like this, noticing early warning signs in yourself or your friends' partners, please say something. You can help stop cycles of abuse if you notice these early red flags. If you're further into it, there are so many people and organizations that can help you. You are stronger than you think. You can do this. You can get out. I believe in you. This is what Marissa felt so passionate about, empowering women, advocating for those suffering domestic violence, helping them find a way out to find themselves again. She dreamed of spending her life showing other victims there's a light at the end of the dark, gloomy tunnel. Her own words, so powerful and heartbreaking. That's what's been getting me the last few weeks, and it's getting me again. To hear she had so much hope, the strength of Melissa Delgado, is incredible. Marissa's ambition to educate others has found its way into the classroom, the college classroom she used to sit in. Her former college tutor tells Marissa's story to every student who comes through that door. They'll be aware of who Marissa was, her memory, what kind of woman she was, how strong she was. They use Marissa's story as an example to show that one person cannot make an abusive relationship work. In every abusive relationship, time does not exist. There's always an urgency to leave. Marissa thought she had more time until all her time was taken from her. All three of her beautiful children ended up moving in with her mother, Lydia, and have had a happy, safe, warm, and loving childhood in her home. Even though they had a tortured childhood at Derek's hands, I hope they find peace knowing their mother has helped so many other women escape domestic violence and will continue to do so. Melissa Delgado's story is one that needs to be spread far and wide, not only as a warning to other women going through something like this, but as a symbol of hope and strength. Marissa was all of that right up until the very last minute. She was an incredible woman, an incredible mother to her 3 children, an incredible student, a woman who wanted to make a difference. My God, is she still doing that? That's everything we have for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. It really means a lot to us. Like I said, this case has hit me in the heart for the last few weeks, and I don't think I'll stop thinking about it for a long, long time. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up. If you want a free way to support me and the team behind these videos, engaging with the video will help push it out on YouTube. That's all we want, all we ask. If you leave a thumbs up or a comment, we're eternally grateful. We read the comments all the time as a team, so I look forward to reading yours this time too. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be one on screen for you to click on. With all that said, have a happy Easter, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.